Well, that's an introduction I can't possibly live up to. Thank you very much. I have to start with a confession. I am here as an outsider. I am a philosopher among the saints. In biblical language, all Christians are saints. The word means holy and set apart. I don't think any of us here are going to be canonized saints, which are first-rate, first-rank saints, although you never know, but second-rate saints or 32nd-rate saints, saints in kindergarten, saints in training. Well, how then am I an outsider? For in that sense, I too am a saint, a 32nd-rate saint. Because I am here as a philosopher, and that makes me a kind of outsider, not just one who does what we are all doing here, but also one who reflects on what we are doing here. As a mirror is not just one of the things in a room, but also reflects the other things in the room. So what is the difference between a philosopher and an ordinary sane person? Ordinary people live and love and witness, but philosophers reflect about life and love and witnessing. A philosopher once died and met God outside the gates of heaven, and God offered the philosopher the choice between going to heaven or going to a philosophy lecture about heaven. The philosopher chose the lecture. But we're all reflecting on witnessing here, aren't we? We're all thinking about witnessing as one of the things that's meant by being a saint, being a Christian, being a Catholic. That's true, but my assignment was to philosophize, that is, to think about our thinking about witnessing. I haven't defined witnessing yet, but whatever it is, witnessing is more important than reflecting on it. And reflecting on it is more important than reflecting on it. So I'm doing only the third most important thing now. In my field, education, we have an in-house joke about doing that third thing instead of the first or second thing. It's about courses in education. It says, those who can, do, those who can't, teach, and those who can't teach, teach teaching. So what can a philosopher do to help us all to reflect on witnessing? We can do what Socrates would do if he were here. Why Socrates? Because Thomas Aquinas, who was the greatest philosopher who ever lived, said that Socrates was the greatest philosopher who ever lived. In the Summa, Aquinas asks why Jesus never wrote anything. And his answer was that Jesus was like Socrates, who also never wrote anything. They taught in a higher way. Their personal example was so perfect that they didn't need to add to it by writing a book. They taught the truth by living it. Other philosophers taught the truth by writing books that told the truth. And we third-rate teachers teach the truth by teaching about those who taught it by telling it. So let's do what the history of philosophy did. Let's begin with Socrates. Socrates witnessed in three ways, one by one. First, he looked at or witnessed real concrete examples of real concrete people doing real concrete things, which were examples of the thing he was trying to define, whether it's justice or beauty or death or whatever. Second, he tried to find the universal and necessary truth about this thing, the unchangeable essence of it, and to put it into words, to testify to it. Third, he died for the truth. He was killed for the crime of speaking the truth. He was a martyr. Now, I just summarized my talk. Those are the three meanings of witnessing: seeing it, saying it, and suffering for it. Socrates' assumption was that we must begin by asking the what question, because that's where we all do, in fact, begin. Socrates was humble enough to learn from children. And children sometimes have to take a drink nowadays. And that's the first question a little child asks. What is it? When my son, at the age of 2, learned that things have names, he ran around the house pointing to everything and asking, what that, what that, what that? He was a philosopher. Socrates was humble enough to begin with this humblest and simplest of all questions. He sought for the true definition of what a thing really is. But when he did that, when he began with this simplest of questions, he discovered a surprise, that enterprise was far less simple than it seemed. You can't just look up truth in a dictionary. Dictionaries do indeed give us definitions, but Socrates was looking for real definitions, not just nominal definitions. That is, definitions of realities, not just noumena or words. In other words, he wanted to know not just how people do in fact use a word, which is what dictionaries tell you, but how they ought to use a word. He demanded definitions of a thing's essence or essential nature, like what is human nature, what is truth, what is goodness, what is beauty, what is justice, what is friendship, what is art, what is wisdom, what is death. So I have to begin by defining the essence of witnessing. And perhaps I will end there too. Perhaps that's all we can do today. Erasmus wrote, "Saint Socrates, pray for us." I echo that, because the question of what a thing is often ignored both by ordinary people and even by some philosophers, many of whom are nominalists. That means they don't believe that universal essences or universal natures really exist, but they're only words, names that we invent, as transgenderists believe that we, not God or nature, invented sex. They're taking control of our culture and of our categories. The questions we are asked when we fill out forms is no longer sex, but sex assigned at birth, as if doctors or parents, rather than God or nature, assign our sex. Nominalists are skeptical of universal truths. In other words, they believe that it is a universal truth that there are no universal truths. The currently most fashionable philosophy in the humanities is postmodernism or deconstructionism, whose sworn enemy is what they call logocentrism. Logos being the Greek word for intelligible reality, truth, universal nature, or essence, and any words that claim to express that. And that is a logically self-contradictory philosophy. But they no longer believe in logic. Logic is logocentric. So is Christianity, which identifies the Logos with Christ. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God, and the Logos became flesh. So anti-logocentrism is really anti-Christocentrism, or the philosophy of the Antichrist. Fortunately, that doesn't matter very much because almost no one takes philosophers seriously anymore, except other philosophers, and perhaps resident psychiatrists in insane asylums. The larger philosophy and the larger problem is that not just philosophers, but ordinary people ignore the question, what is it? For instance, in the hundreds of controversies and arguments about abortion that I have read or heard in popular media lately, the one question I have never seen the popular pro-choice establishment face is the most important question of all. Just what is abortion? What is it? Without that, we simply don't know what we're talking about. Well, that's actually a great advantage when you want to do what used to be called a snow job or propaganda. The same refusal to face the what is it question is true of the LGBT establishment. The simple question of what sodomy or homosexual sexual activity actually and literally is not only never answered, it's never asked. In fact, it is forbidden to say the answer. It is forbidden to describe what it in fact is. That is to say or testify, the second meaning of witness, what you can see, which is the first meaning of witness, namely eyewitnessing. Saying what you see here is forbidden. Doing it is not forbidden, but saying it is. In fact, it's classified as hate speech. So in this case, giving true definitions is a crime for which you can be punished and penalized and martyred, usually in a fairly mild way, like losing your job. That is an example of how the three meanings of witness are interrelated. But giving a true definition of witnessing is not yet a crime, so we're free to do it here. It's possible to think that witnessing itself is a crime, for proselytizing, which is almost another word for one kind of witnessing, is indeed a crime in at least two cultures. In many Muslim cultures, witnessing for Christ is a crime punishable by death. And in many places in the culture that used to be called Christendom, that same thing, witnessing for Christ, is punishable by less severe penalties, although witnessing or proselytizing for Muhammad is not. What then is witnessing? Let me first summarize my bottom line and then try to unpack it. What we witness to in all three kinds of witnessing that I've distinguished, namely seeing, saying, and suffering, is truth. There are three kinds of truth witnessed to: seeing what is really there, saying what you see, and suffering for saying it, even to the extent of martyrdom, if necessary. Now, let's unpack that threefold definition of witnessing. To begin with, the word witness is primarily a verb. The noun, a witness, is derived from the verb to witness. A witness is one who witnesses, as a singer is one who sings, and a sinner is one who sins. Being itself is a verb before it is a noun. A being is something that has the act of being, the act of existing. Being is what bees do. That's a pun, but it's not very punny. So what is it to witness? I see three different but related meanings to the word in seeing, saying, and suffering. That is, to discover, to declare, and to die. So a witness is, first of all, one who discovers, who sees something with his eyes, an eyewitness. Secondly, it's one who says what he has seen, who testifies with his tongue, especially in court or in religion, two areas of life that are set apart and solemn, that is, sacred. Third, the word in Greek literally means martyr, one who dies for his witness, for his testimony, for what he has said. Thus, there's three kinds of true witnessing and three kinds of false witnessing. In the first sense, to see what is there is true seeing, or true witnessing, and to see what is not there is false seeing, or being deceived, either physically by an optical illusion, or psychologically by a hallucination, or intellectually by propaganda and sophistry. Second, to testify to the truth that you see is true witnessing, and to lie is to bear false witness. One of the 10 Commandments forbids bearing false witness, that is, public, solemn lies. I think that little private tricks like surprise parties or head fakes in basketball or police undercover work or sting operations to catch drug dealers or human traffickers or disguises or even wartime spying, and certainly keeping secrets like lying to the Nazis about where the Jews are hiding, are not examples of false witnessing, although they all are examples of deliberate deceiving. Frauds, scams, and outright lies are. They are bearing false witness. That's not sophisticated philosophy, that's common sense. Theories defending moral common sense may be tricky, but appealing to common sense and using it is not, because there is an innate and universal natural moral law of common sense that clearly speaks in at least 99% of all situations. Third, to suffer and die for the truth that you see and say is to be a martyr. And that is the fullest, most complete witnessing to the truth. And to live a lie and then die for a lie, as terrorists and suicides do, is the most full form of false witnessing. So the first meaning of witness is an act done with the eyes. An eyewitness sees something, for instance, Disney World, or an event, for instance, an auto accident, or a person, for instance, Jesus. Truth here is easy to define. It is the conformity or correspondence between what you see and think, on the one hand, and what really is, on the other hand. In other words, the conformity of your subjective senses or mind to objective reality. And false witness is being deceived, either in your senses or in your mind. Both truth and error, in this sense, are passive or receptive. Your eyes or your mind receive either truth or error, either what really is, what it seems to be, or what is not. But in the second meaning of witnessing, that is bearing witness, both truth and error are active. They are choices that you make. The second meaning of witnessing, the act done by the tongue or the pen, a telling, a testifying, or a testimony, especially in court or religion, is what we mean by bearing witness. Bearing witness with your words to what you have eyewitnessed with your eyes, especially by taking a solemn oath. When you take an oath, you put yourself under the oath. An oath binds you. It puts you under a curse if you lie. When you swear a solemn oath, you freely choose to agree to those terms. You take the oath's curse upon you. For instance, a Mongolian accused of stealing a yurt might swear this oath: if I really stole that yurt, may a diseased yak with hemorrhoids sit on my mother's face. Lies are not just errors, they are freely chosen, they're deliberate. An error is only the involuntarily or unwilledly false lack of correspondence between what you see with your eyes or think with your mind on the one hand and what really is on the other hand. In contrast, a lie is the voluntary, willed non-correspondence between what you say and what you believe is true. Error is being deceived, lying is deceiving. We can very easily be deceived, and we can very easily deceive. Only God can never either deceive or be deceived. That is why the most important argument in Christian apologetics works. It's the Lord, liar, or lunatic argument that argues for Jesus' divinity, for only God cannot be either a liar or a lunatic, either a deceiver or deceived. So if the man who claimed to be God isn't God, then he must be either a liar or a lunatic. Either he knows he's not God, and thus he's the world's biggest liar, or else he doesn't know that he's not God, in which case he's the world's biggest lunatic. If you can't call Jesus either a liar or a lunatic, you must call him the Lord, as he claimed to be. The one and only thing Jesus cannot possibly be is the thing nearly all non-Christians believe he is, namely a wise and good and trustable man who is neither a liar nor a lunatic nor the Lord. Three different forms of lying or bearing false witness are hypocrisy, sin, and propaganda. Hypocrisy is a form of lying. It is often wrongly defined as not practicing what you preach. That's not a good definition, because by that definition, we're all hypocrites, except those who preach nothing, who have no ideals at all. No, hypocrisy is not believing what you preach, preaching what you believe to be false. St. Thomas Aquinas, of all people, says that if a Catholic sincerely but wrongly believes that the Church is in error, For him to continue to profess what he believes to be a lie and to remain a professing Catholic is for him a mortal sin, for it is a sin of hypocrisy. But if he leaves the church because he has been sincerely but stupidly deceived by her enemies, that may be a venial sin, but is not necessarily a mortal sin. Sin is bearing false witness in your life to what you know in your mind and believe in your heart that you ought to do and be. That is, not practicing what you preach, at least what you preach to yourself by your conscience. Actions, of course, speak louder than words, but both your visible actions and your audible words are witnesses in this second sense. They testify to how much and how totally you believe, how much your faith, in the sense of belief, manifests itself in your faith in the sense of fidelity. The great chapter on faith, Hebrews 11, identifies the heroes of faith like Abraham and Elijah by what they did by their faith, not just by what they believed. Thus, all sinners must pray the prayer that sounds like an oxymoron. Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. When I judge my faith by Jesus' standard, I know that my faith, though real, is tiny. In fact, a lot smaller than a mustard seed, because it is not moving mountains. There are, of course, greatly different degrees of this kind of false witnessing, that is, sin, this nonconformity in our life to what we believe in our mind and heart. Not all sin is mortal sin, and not all mortal sin is blasphemy. We're all sinners, and some of us have mortal sins as well as venial sins to confess, but pedophile priests, for example, are also blasphemers. Jesus said something shocking about them. Gentle, kind, loving, forgiving Jesus said that those who scandalize his little children and lead them into sin deserve to have great millstones hung around their neck and to be thrown into the sea. Why? Because that sin is worse than murder, because its victim is not bodies but souls. The perpetrators are priests, priests of Christ, witnesses to Christ. Their priesthood witnesses or testifies to Christ, shows Christ to the world. So by being priests, they say to the world, I am a sign of Christ. I bring Christ to you. And then they abuse children, implicitly saying that that is how they show their victims who Jesus is and what Jesus does. I hope you are shocked by this, for it is truly shocking. St. Paul said something similarly shocking, that when a Christian has sex with a prostitute, he makes Jesus Christ to have sex with a prostitute, because a Christian is part of the body of Christ. His words are these: your bodies are members of Christ. Shall I then take the members of Christ and make them members of a prostitute? The Greek word translated members here means body parts, organs, members in a body, not members of a club or a business organization or a political party. So those are two very shocking examples of bearing false witness by acts, not just by words. Bearing true witness by words and by acts is both speaking the truth and living it. Living it is primary because we can't trust the message if we can't trust the messenger. As the old saying goes, what you are speaks so loud I can hardly hear what you say. Christ had some things that are very hard to believe, to say to us, and we believe them only because we believe him. We bank on him. We trust him. The church is the first supranational bank and trust company. The word evangelism is derived from the word evangelium, a Greek word meaning good news or gospel. The job of these superhuman creatures that we call angels is, at least in part, to witness by telling the good news. Angels are God's press corps, God's media. Human evangelists are an extension of the angels, of their witness. How did our witness of evangelism work so well in the first few Christian centuries that it converted the tough-minded, hard-headed pagan Roman world? Because Christians witnessed to Christ with both their words and their lives to the point of martyrdom, which is the supreme witness. Martyrdom does not in itself prove truth. Martyrs for false causes can be deeply deceived, but martyrdom at least proves sincerity. No one dies for a known lie. The modern Western world no longer believes in Christ because they don't see that witness, that martyrdom. It was the saints and martyrs, not the philosophers and theologians, who won the pagan West for Christ when Christendom was young. And it is the lack of saints and martyrs that is losing that world to Antichrist today, where Christendom is old and dying. Chesterton wrote, "The strongest argument against Christianity is Christians." It's also true that the strongest argument for Christianity is Christians. Nobody ever won an argument with Mother Teresa. There is no argument against beauty. And the deep joy of a saint is the greatest beauty we will ever see with our natural human eyes in this world. The only greater beauty is in a crucifix and in the Eucharist. And that beauty is perceived only with the eye of faith, which is a supernatural gift, a gift God gives to everyone who sincerely seeks it. The Church makes that beauty present to us because she makes Christ present to us and us to him. The Church is like a time machine. She bridges the 2,000-year gap between us and the historical Christ and his sacrifice on the cross. She does this by bringing Christ forward to us through time and bringing us backward to him. She does this in two ways. The two ways Jesus himself did it to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus, through word and sacrament. The two disciples said after that encounter, "Did not our hearts burn within us when he opened the scriptures," the gospel of the burning heart? And then at supper, they recognized him in the breaking of the bread. The Mass and the Eucharist is the Church's primary time machine. And the eye of faith is our eyewitness that sees there his real presence and power and glory. Her other time machine is the verbal witness or testimony to Christ by apostolic succession. For the bishops are the chain of witnesses, the witnesses to Christ and his resurrection that Christ himself ordained. If we are Catholics, that is our mission too. Witnessing, evangelizing. It's not just clergy and not just men who are evangelists. Mary Magdalene was the first evangelist, the first witness to Christ's resurrection. She's called the apostle to the apostles. The Church is fundamentally the historical chain of witnesses. In 1 Corinthians 15, St. Paul mentions 500 persons who witnessed with their eyes the resurrected Christ. Most of them, he says, are still alive, so he implicitly invites his readers to interview them. It's that literal, that concrete, that factual, that empirical, that historical, that physical. We all carry on this chain of witnessing through history and through time in the same two ways as the whole Church does, by word and sacrament, by our confession of faith in our words and our deeds, and by the sacramental presence of Christ in our bodies and in our souls and in our lives through the Eucharist. The capstone of both kinds of witnessing is martyrdom. For some, this is the red martyrdom of blood. For others, for most, it is the white martyrdom of suffering, of self-sacrifice, of agape love. Our love witnesses to Christ, to who Christ is, as Christ's love witnesses to who God the Father is, who God is. Who is God then? God is love, and he who lives in love lives in God and God in him. Our witness is to this inness, this withness, which binds the Trinity together. Agape love is a stronger oneness, a stronger glue than mere arithmetical unity. We are his witnesses. What a terrifying power and responsibility that is. People are looking for God, and they see us. We are the most powerful reasons, the most powerful arguments for Christianity, that Christ has put his church in charge of jackasses. He used one once before, and he keeps using them today, because he is Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever. He uses not only the stallions, the canonized saints, but also the stubborn little mules and donkeys and their colts, don't forget the colts, the children, to ride into Jerusalem in triumph. And he will ride into the New Jerusalem on the last day on the same animals as he rode when he rode into the Old Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, if we are only willing to carry him. His mission, his cross, his martyrdom is terrifying to us, because that terror, as well as that power, is also our mission. We are called to share his suffering. And that's terrifying, but that's only one side of the coin. The other half is that he is sharing all our suffering, and that is tremendously comforting. An old hymn says, "Must Jesus bear his cross alone and all the saints go free? No, there's a cross for everyone, and there's a cross for me." That seems like bad news at first, but it's really good news. Jesus did something much better than taking away our sufferings. He transformed them so that they are now his. They are redemptive. They are the most powerful force in the world, the union of suffering and love, which is the meaning of martyrdom. Love without suffering is good but weak, and suffering without love is strong but not good. But suffering love, that's the irresistible force in the universe. This third meaning of witness, namely martyrdom, is essential, not accidental. That's our vocation. Our primary witness and our primary evangelism, our primary argument is our love. You can argue with words forever, but you can't argue with love, especially the love that says not merely, "I feel good about you," or "you make me feel good," but "this is my body, given up for you." Christ says that to us, and we carry it on. We say it to others. That's our mission, our witnessing, to say that to others with our love. Love speaks. Love says a word. Pascal says the heart has its reasons, which the reason does not know. The heart is a part of the intellect. It's not just feeling. Much deeper than that. Dying is only one form of suffering. And there's no suffering greater, I think, in this world than to see those whom you deeply love, those whom you passionately will good to, when you see them rejecting the good and the joy that comes from Christ. In other words, Christian parents whose children have rejected Christ are the primary martyrs of our culture. There's no way out of this suffering, because there's no Christ without the cross, although there are many crosses without Christ. The first noble truth of Buddha was that to live is to suffer. For Christianity, to love is to suffer. And Christ invited us into that love suffering. In contrast, Buddha invited us to be saved from that. To give your heart away in love is always inevitably to have your heart broken. But the only whole heart is one that has been broken. The only possible path to avoid suffering is to avoid loving. And to avoid loving is the supreme suffering of all. St. Ignatius of Loyola famously said that the glory of God is a man fully alive. The debased popular interpretation of that saying reduces being fully alive to something merely natural, to human joys and passions, which are great, but not the greatest thing. For fully alive means not just natural life, but supernatural life. not just bios, but zoe. A man fully alive bears witness to Christ by being what he is. He wears no halo, but his face wears a deep smile behind the creases of suffering, and even in the creases, as with Mother Teresa. Her creases have creases. And his eyes shine like hers. People who know Christ see this in Christians, and they say, he has been with Christ. It's his very being that bears witness to his withness. He is with Christ, in Christ, just as Christ is with his Father and in his Father. Withness, inness, interpersonal presence is the meaning of love, because it is the very nature of the Trinitarian God. C.S. Lewis describes this participation in divine life in these words when writing about the most essential virtue, humility, just as the most essential sin is pride. He says, "Do not imagine that if you met a really humble man, he would be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of smarmy person who's always telling you, of course, he is nobody. Probably all you will think about him is that he seemed a cheerful chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you do dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so much. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. And when the world sees the witness of that joy and life and light and love in us, then the culture that we used to call Christendom, the culture that we won for Christ and which we are now losing to Satan, will be won back for Christ, but not before and in no other way. No one but saints can save our broken world or our broken hearts and lives. No one but saints can even establish social justice. What a terrifying responsibility that is. God put the salvation of our poor world into our hands, into the hands of the church, that is, into the hands of jackasses. But they're his jackasses. And he uses even our weak and wobbly witnessing, our blinking little lights, to conquer this present darkness that is smothering the world. And his ways are always stranger and stronger, wilder and wiser than our ways, and also more glorious and triumphant in the end. For divine love is stronger than death itself, so that we can pray in the words of the old oratorio, "Thou hast made death glorious and triumphant, for through its portals we enter into the presence of the living God." That is the good news of which we are witnesses. And after the last of these three meanings of witness, namely martyrdom, death, we will see God face to face. We will return to the beginning, to the first of the three meanings of witnessing. We will be eyewitnesses of God.